swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Can you have a seat, please?
Thank you very much.
I think we need a fresh stylus for you, just in case.
Thank you so much.
Let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
My full name is David Richard Fowler. David, D-A-V-I-D, Richard, R-I-C-H-A-R-D, Fowler, F-O-W-L-E-R.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fowler, are you presently employed?
I am retired.
Okay. Could you tell the jury a little bit about what you did prior to your retirement?
Prior to my retirement, I have been full-time in forensic pathology since about 1986, which is when I first started training in that discipline. And I have been full-time within that discipline for 30-some years, whatever that number is.
Where did you work prior to retirement?
I worked at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland.
Do you have any other employment, either before your retirement or subsequent to your retirement?
Yes, I would do the occasional consultation case during the time prior to my retirement, and I have done some since my retirement.
Could you tell us a little bit about your education and background?
Certainly. I graduated from the University of Cape Town in South Africa in 1983. I did a year of internship in general medicine and general surgery. That's required in South Africa before you can get a medical license. I then followed that with a year of training in pediatric pathology at the Red Cross Children's Hospital in Cape Town. And completing that year, I entered a full-time 5-year training program at the University of Cape Town in forensic pathology.
And are you board certified?
I am. And so the system in South Africa is that you eventually graduate with a Master of Medicine in your discipline. So I ended up with a Master of Medicine in forensic pathology, which qualifies you in the South African system to be what they call a specialist, which in this country is the same as an attending physician, just different terminology. But that's equivalent to board certification here. When I came to the United States, I felt it was very important to get an American qualification if I was going to work in this country full-time. And so I went back, and the American Board of Pathology demands that all pathology training is done in the United States or Canada. So, if I wanted to do that and be eligible for their examination process, I had to then go back and retrain. So I went to the University of Maryland for 2 years to complete additional anatomic pathology training to qualify me for that portion of the examination process, and then 2 years of forensic pathology training at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. I then took my board examinations through the American Board of Pathology in anatomic and forensic pathology, and passed those exams.
Great. So how did your career progress after you received all of that education?
So at about the time that I finished my training, I was recruited full-time into the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner as an assistant medical examiner. And that
What year was that?
I would have to look at my CV to be absolutely certain, 95 or 96, somewhere in that range.
Are you a licensed physician in the United States?
Yes, I am.
Now, you were educated in large part in South Africa, but then also here in the United States. Are there some differences between the degrees, or are they the same?
There are different letters after your name. But so if you go through the system which is derived from the old British examination process, you end up with a MB-CHB, and some of them have different letters, which basically mean you have 2 bachelor's degrees, a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. And it's a 6-year training program, not a 4-year training program like you have in the United States. Just different ways of getting to the same end point. if you want to work as a physician in the United States, you have to go through a process which, when I went through it, was run by the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. And they make an assessment as to whether or not the university that you went to meets the appropriate standards. And these are all universities that are approved by the World Health Organization as meeting certain standards. Once you've been approved and your university is recognized, then you have to go through a set of board examinations which are very similar to all US graduates graduating from a US university. So nowadays they are known as the USMLE examination. So we go through exactly the same process for evaluation. And then you can you can apply for a medical license in the United States based on that process.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. And in terms of, just to clarify, you are a licensed physician?
Yes, I am.
All right. And you have board certifications in forensic pathology and anatomic pathology, that's correct?
Yes, I do.
And you worked as a pathologist or a forensic pathologist in the United States since approximately 1995?
So that's when I qualified and finished my training in the United States. But I was working as a pathologist all the way from the time I arrived in 1991. So I've had uninterrupted work within pathology all the way from 1990, when I started my training in pediatric pathology at the Red Cross Children's Hospital, which was probably back in 1985. But some of that is training, so the question is whether you want to count that as being a pathologist or just a trainee pathologist.
Okay. What is a pathologist? How would you describe that to the jury?
Typically, the pathologist that most people will not come across because they work in the laboratory in a hospital. And they are the individuals who will run the laboratories, and those laboratories are the ones that take the samples which are taken from individuals during treatment by the surgeons and other clinicians, physicians, and do the analysis on those. So blood specimens, urine specimens, and then any biopsies or surgical specimens that are removed from an individual are analyzed in the laboratory by a pathologist. And that is the anatomic pathology training, as well as some of that is clinical pathology.
Can you tell the jury a little bit about your work with the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office?
Yes. So, having finished my training in forensic pathology, I was recruited, became an assistant medical examiner, did that for several years, and then was offered the position of deputy chief medical examiner. And in Maryland, they have two deputies, one which is in charge of autopsy services, and one which is in charge of statewide services. So the one in charge of autopsy services focuses most of their work on supervising the autopsy process and the staff that are doing that, as well as continuing to do autopsies themselves. Statewide services is the individual who then looks at the investigations which are going on statewide. And so this is a big jurisdiction here in Minneapolis, but Maryland, the population served by the medical examiner's office is about 6 million people. It's the entire state out of one office. And so we have a lot of investigators out in the counties doing work, and the coordination and supervision of that falls to the deputy chief for statewide services. So having been the deputy chief for autopsy services for several years, the chief medical examiner asked me then to take over statewide services, which I did for several years. I was in that position when he suddenly passed away, so the health department asked me to act as the interim or acting chief medical examiner until they could find somebody to take the position permanently.
And how long did you act as the chief medical examiner?
So I was acting chief medical examiner for about a year, and after a national search, the health department appointed me into the position as chief medical examiner. So I believe that was 2002, 2003, about 2003 if I remember correctly.
Okay. And you served in that capacity until your retirement?
Yes, it was about 17 years in that position.
So what type of work is done at the medical examiner's office? I mean, you've explained kind of the differences in the statewide versus the autopsies.
So the difference between what's done in the hospital and what's done at a medical examiner's office is, in the hospital, the pathologists are looking largely at natural disease. There will be some traumatic specimens come from trauma patients, but most of what they're doing is looking at natural disease. The forensic pathologist is an individual who's gone on to do that additional training in wound patterns and other non-natural events that threaten life and cause death. So at the end of the process, you have the knowledge base of all the natural diseases that a general pathologist has, plus the additional training to evaluate how people die in unusual circumstances, sudden deaths while not attended, or any deaths which are traumatic. So that's the additional training. That portion is what's done at a medical examiner's office, are these sudden, unexpected deaths. And so the best way of thinking of a medical examiner's office is a 24-hour emergency medical institution. People die all the time. It's got to be available 24 hours. All of these deaths, you need to respond to them rapidly and appropriately and in a dignified way. So it's a 24-hour emergency medical institution with the one responsibility at the end of the day of making a determination of the cause of death of the individual that has suddenly died.
In addition to your work at the medical examiner's office, did you also do some teaching?
Yes.
Where?
So I've taught at the University of Maryland. I'm a professor in both pediatrics and pathology at that particular institution. I've taught at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. I've taught at multiple hospitals in the Maryland, D.C. area. I've taught at the FBI Academy. I've been invited as a guest lecturer and or visiting professor at multiple universities internationally.
In terms of your work as the chief pathologist, did you also train other forensic pathologists?
Yes. So for a portion of my career, while I was an assistant medical examiner, I was directly responsible for training the forensic pathologists. In other words, when a forensic pathologist trainee, what we would call a fellow, is doing a case, I would be directly supervising everything that they did on that case. And it would be my responsibility to ensure that that case was done correctly. And so it's almost like an apprenticeship, and they are standing, they're going to do the case, but you're going to be watching carefully and evaluating every single part of that process as they gradually grow through that learning curve to become a forensic pathologist. So for a while I was hands-on actually teaching at the autopsy table. When I became deputy chief, I continued to do that, but one of the roles that was assigned to me was the residency director position for the office. And so that is the position where you supervise the residency program and how that program is accredited and evaluated by an outside agency, so you have to make sure that all of those requirements are done. So that's just an additional layer on top of that.
So were you responsible for recruiting the residents and things of that nature?
Recruiting, evaluating, bringing them in, and then obviously training, evaluating. And at the end of the process, each of those fellows, before they can take the board exam in forensic pathology, require that the institution complete a declaration that they have met the standards in order to practice. And that is before they can take the exam. So they are constantly evaluated daily, quarterly, and then at the end of the year to ensure that they have met the standards that we can attest to, so they are then qualified to take the examination through the American Board of Pathology.
And you've testified in cases before?
Yes.
State and federal?
Yes.
Civil and criminal?
Yes.
Can you estimate how many times you've testified in cases over the course of your career?
Gosh, over the 30-some years, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times.
Now, Have you ever published any articles or peer-reviewed journal type information?
Both publications and presentations I've been involved. Publications, it has to be closing in on 100, but I haven't looked at my CV and counted them recently.
Okay. At the Office of the Chief Medical Examiners, do you review every homicide?
That was the policy, that the chief would get to review all homicides, all pediatric cases that were under the age of about 2 years, and then any case which the medical examiner could not determine the cause of death.
Okay. And how many homicides did you review?
Typically, the number of homicides in Maryland each year would vary between 500 and 600. So that would be the homicides alone. And then the other cases that added on to that would add an additional load of perhaps 50 to 100 cases.
So in this capacity, in this case, are you associated with an organization called the Forensics Panel?
Yes.
Can you just generally describe what the Forensics Panel is?
The Forensic Panel is a national organization that looks at cases and does evaluations on cases in the forensic sciences, the medical sciences, and the behavioral sciences. So it's a forensic science organization that looks at those particular issues.
What is your role with the Forensics Panel?
I am a forensic pathology consultant.
In terms of the Forensics Panel, what's unique about how that organization operates?
So the Forensic Panel really started the process of peer review evaluations in order to ensure that the case was diligently evaluated, objectively evaluated, and was based in the known science. So that's the first thing, and it's peer review, and that has evolved over time. Then it's an organization which has many different disciplines recognized or that are recognized working within it. So it's a multidisciplinary team. So you have experts in all sorts of medical fields that can be assigned to the case depending on the nature of the case. It's an independent organization.
Is it similar to what's called an M&M conference?
A mortality and morbidity is what you're referring to. That is something very similar that happens in the average hospital when a patient may have something adverse happen to them, not necessarily fatal, that's the morbidity part, or it is fatal, mortality. And in those circumstances, physicians will present in a closed environment all of the materials and their evaluation, and the general physician population that have gone to that conference can sit down and critique it, evaluate it, and it's an opportunity for self-evaluation, learning for people, and quality assurance for the hospital program. Yes, it's similar.
How did you end up working within the Forensic Panel, and when?
About 15 years ago, I was approached by the Forensic Panel, and they indicated that another forensic pathologist had recommended me as somebody who might well fit their program.
And so within the panel there, you described it as a multidisciplinary approach. How does that function?
So, depending on the nature of the case, the Forensic Panel will assign individuals that have skills in areas that the case apparently needs from an evaluation process. So,
and you're compensated for your time?
I am.
And your hourly rate?
It's $350 an hour.
You at some point became involved in this case, State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin?
I did.
And how did you become involved in this case?
The Forensic Panel, I was approached and asked to become part of it, and I felt that this was such a complex and difficult case that this would better fit working through the Forensic Panel than trying to handle this case independently. So I referred this case to the forensic panel.
And you were approached by me, correct?
I believe that was the first conversation I had, yes. It was a while back.
And you referred me to the forensics panel.
That's my recollection, yes.
Now, in terms of this particular case, how many of these peer reviewers were ultimately involved?
There were 13 peer reviewers across multiple disciplines that were involved in this case.
How is it useful for you to have those peer reviewers involved?
Well, several of the peer reviewers, I believe 7, are forensic pathologists, so my direct colleagues with the same training and skill set that you would expect a good forensic pathologist to have. There were additional individuals in behavioral health, pulmonologists, emergency room physicians, toxicologists that were present as part of the evaluation team, because they have the detailed knowledge in those other areas that really helps critique any opinions that I may form and provide their expertise in ensuring that everything was looked at and that any opinion that is expressed is based in science.
What's the process that you apply in approaching a case such as this?
So the primary reviewer in a case like that will be provided all of the available information that has been given to the forensic panel. They will go through that material, study it, evaluate it, and then the peer reviewers are given a similar but sometimes slightly less onerous package of materials, but they are given similar materials. They will go through it, and then I would, in this case, as I did in this case, I've been a review pathologist on several, and in this case I was the primary. I will do a presentation to the forensic panel, and during that time they have the opportunity to evaluate and critique my opinion. Based on that, if there's additional information that is necessary in order to help refine the opinions, that request can go back to the forensic panel and through to whichever attorney, whether it be a prosecutor or a defense attorney, a plaintiff's attorney, or a defense attorney. Requests for the appropriate additional information can be made, and if that information is available, sent back so we can complete and try and ensure that we haven't missed anything. So there may be several reviews along the way, and then at some point, if the
Objection, Your Honor, to the narrative nature of the response, and could we, Your Honor, approach the bench?
Senator Burke.